The village of Fontaine de Vaucluse sits about 30 kilometers east of Avignon in the Vaucluse department of Provence. The village takes its name from the spring at the base of the cliff behind it, the spring that is the reason the village exists, the reason the poet Petrarch lived here in the 14th century and wrote about it. The reason visitors have been coming to this particular bend in the Provençal landscape for centuries. The spring is the largest karst spring in France and the 5th largest in the world. At peak flow, after significant rainfall or snowmelt in the mountains of the Vaucluse Plateau above it, discharges more than 90 cubic meters of water per second into the Sorgue River below it. 90 cubic meters per second is not a measurement that has much meaning until you watch the spring in high water, when the pool at the base of the cliff ceases to look like a pool at all and begins to look like what it actually is, the surface expression of an enormous underground river, forcing itself out of the mountain with a pressure that has no interest in what is in its way. The limestone that feeds the Fontaine de Vaucluse is highly karstified, dissolved by water movement over millions of years into a network of underground passages that extends through approximately 1,100 square kilometers of catchment area. The mountains of Ventoux and Loure to the north, the Vaucluse Plateau to the south, all of the rainfall and snowmelt that moves through that limestone eventually comes out here. At this specific point, through this specific opening. And at the bottom of that opening, below the pool, the passage descends into the mountain at an angle that no human being has followed to its end. In 2002, archaeologists recovering material from the spring found approximately 8,800 Roman gold and bronze coins on the floor of the upper section. The Romans had been offering gifts to the spring for centuries to whatever they understood to be responsible for the force of it. They had identified, without measuring or mapping, that the thing below the pool was worth appeasing. They were not wrong. Jacques Cousteau came to the Fontaine de Vaucluse in 1946 with his team from the French Navy's Underseas Research Group. He had already established himself as a pioneer of the aqualung, the breathing apparatus that would eventually become the foundation of modern scuba diving, and the spring at Fontaine de Vaucluse represented an obvious challenge for the new technology. A spring that had been described for centuries as bottomless. A pool that nobody had ever successfully descended into, with equipment capable of recording what was there. He later described what followed as the most dangerous dive of his life. He made more than 5,000 dives. Cousteau and his colleague, Frédéric Dumas, descended together into the spring. What they encountered at depth was not what they had planned, for the air in their cylinders had been contaminated with carbon monoxide, a failure in the filling process that neither man knew about before they entered the water. At approximately 120 meters depth, 400 feet, Cousteau regained consciousness to find himself lying on the floor of what he described as a vast, drowned cave. Beside him, Dumas was floating helplessly, his diving suit almost completely flooded, 25 stone of dead weight in dark water at depth, with no ability to ascend under his own power. Cousteau did what the situation required. He began climbing. He described it afterward, foot by foot, pulling himself up by fingerholds on the rock, stopping when exertion brought him close to losing consciousness again, continuing when he regained enough orientation to continue, dragging Dumas alongside him. At the surface, Maurice Fargues, the surface commander, monitoring the guide rope connecting the divers to the surface, had read the signals on the rope and pulled both men up. They survived. The following year, Maurice Fargues died attempting a depth record dive elsewhere in France. The man who had saved Cousteau and Dumas at the Fontaine de Vaucluse did not survive his next deep dive attempt. The spring that had nearly killed Cousteau kept its secret. In 1878, the first recorded attempt to measure the spring was made by a diver named Ottonelli, who descended to approximately 23 meters using a diving suit with heavy boots. His metal boat, used to transport equipment, sank during the operation. The wreck is still on the floor of the spring at 20 meters. It has been there for almost 150 years. Nobody has removed it. The spring fascinated divers for a century after Ottonelli. The post-Cousteau era brought progressively more capable equipment to Fontaine de Vaucluse, and progressively greater depths, 153 meters reached by Claude Toulongian in 1981, 205 meters by the German technical diver Jochen Hasenmeier in 1983. In 1974, a dive at the spring led to an official decree prohibiting further exploration. The nature of what happened during that dive is not fully detailed in the public record. The prohibition was issued. It held until 1981, when it was lifted and diving resumed. By the mid-1980s, the depths that divers could safely reach had been exceeded by the depth the spring seemed to require. The solution was robots, remote-operated vehicles built specifically for the Fontaine de Vaucluse, capable of descending below the threshold where human physiology became the limiting factor. In 1984, the Sorgonaut 2, a remotely operated vehicle designed and built for this specific purpose, descended into the spring and did not return as planned. It imploded at 205 meters. The pressure at that depth converted the vehicle from an instrument of measurement into wreckage on the floor of the spring, alongside Ottonelli's boat from 1878. The spring now held two machines that had tried to understand it. In 1985, a new remote-operated vehicle, the Medexa, descended into the Fontaine de Vaucluse and reached 308 meters. At 308 meters, it stopped. Not because the spring ended. Because the Medexa found a sandy floor with two galleries extending further in a southeastern direction, and the vehicle had reached the limit of what it could map. The passages went on. The Medexa could not follow them. The deepest human dive in the spring is 205 meters. The deepest any device has reached is 308 meters. At 308 meters, the spring offers more passage. Nobody knows how much more. Nobody knows where the water comes from. In any specific geological sense, the catchment area is known, the flow is measurable, but the actual route from the mountain interior to this pool in this Provençal village at this specific depth has not been traced. The spring keeps its secret at depth the way it has always kept it, not by being impenetrable, but by always having more below whatever has been reached. In the late 1990s, the diving community lost a diver during a deep dive at the spring. The specific details are not fully in the public record. The combination of depth, the specific risks of the Fontaine de Vaucluse at extreme depth, and the history of what the spring had done to divers and robots before claimed another person. The prohibition that had been issued in 1974 and lifted in 1981 reflects a pattern. The spring produces accidents at intervals. The accidents produce restrictions. The restrictions eventually lift, and the spring produces more accidents. This cycle has continued since 1878. The Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin sits in the Western Pyrenees, on the border between France and Spain, in a karst massif that in the early 1950s was the focus of intense French and Spanish speleological attention. The shaft that dropped into the mountain had been discovered and first explored in 1950 and 1951 by a team that included the Belgian physicist Max Cossens, the geologist turned volcanologist Haroun Tazieff, and Norbert Castoret, the most celebrated French cave explorer of the 20th century, a man who had been going underground since the 1920s and who had explored more of the underground Pyrenees than anyone before him. What they had found in the Elpenus shaft was, at the time of its exploration, the deepest reached point in any cave in the world. The shaft dropped 320 meters from its entrance. Beyond it, passages continued further. The cave system at Pierre Saint-Martin was, by the measurements available in 1952, the deepest cave ever explored by human beings. Caves like this do not give up their extent easily. Every meter of the Pierre Saint-Martin had been reached through sustained effort rope ladders and winches, and the physical demand of ascending and descending a 300-meter shaft, carrying equipment into the system by hand, establishing camps at the bottom, and working from there into the passages beyond. By the summer of 1952, the team was returning for their second major expedition. The experience of 1951 had shown them what the system contained and what it would take to go further. They came back with a new piece of equipment they hoped would make the ascent and descent of the main shaft more efficient. An electric winch. Marcel Lubens was born in 1923. He was 28 years old in the summer of 1952. He had been studying under Norbert Castoret since his youth, drawn to caves with a specific intensity that those who knew him described as a passion for depth, a desire to go further into the rock than anyone had gone before. His relationship with Castoret was that of a student devoted to the discipline his teacher had defined. Castoret called him the fallen angel of French speleology, not as criticism, but as an acknowledgement of the quality of commitment that Lubens brought to underground exploration, and the specific brilliance that characterized his work. In 1952, Lubens had spent 96 hours at the bottom of the Pierre Saint-Martin system, 4 days underground, at the furthest reach point in the world's deepest known cave. The day before his planned return to the surface, he and Jacques Cousteau discovered a new chamber at the bottom of a room that had apparently once been an ancient lake, its geology distinctive and unmistakable. That chamber has not been found since. The day after its discovery, Lubens prepared to ascend. The electric winch was new. It had been installed to make the 300-meter ascent and descent faster and safer than the rope ladder method. It was powerful. It was, by the standards of 1952 expedition equipment, a significant improvement. Marcel Lubens was going to be the first person to use it for the ascent. He clipped himself onto the wire cable, backed over the edge of the chasm, and called out to Norbert Castoret standing at the surface, watching him go. Au revoir, papa. He disappeared into the darkness of the shaft. During the ascent, a cable clamp on the winch failed. The clamp, a single bolt, a single point of mechanical connection between the wire and the hauling system, was not what it should have been. Marcel Lubens fell 15 meters inside the shaft before the wire arrested him. The fall fractured his skull. It fractured his spine. His companions at the bottom of the cave, Tazif, Laborie, and others, reached him as quickly as the passage allowed. He was alive. He was in a coma that deepened over the hours that followed as the injuries to his brain progressed beyond what the human body can sustain without the interventions that a hospital 400 meters below in the Western Pyrenees could not provide. The team at the surface attempted to reach him. The winch was compromised. Getting another rescue system rigged into a 300-meter shaft took time that the situation was running out of. A priest held Mass at the entrance. For 36 hours, Marcel Lubens remained at the bottom of the deepest cave in the world, in a coma, surrounded by his companions, while the surface did what surfaces can do, and the cave did what it had always done. On August 13, 1952, at 10:15 in the evening, Marcel Lubens died. He was 28 years old. The cave was too deep, and the systems for getting a body from its bottom to its entrance too limited for an immediate retrieval. The team made the decision that the situation required the same calculation, in a different place, in a different era, with the same outcome. He would stay. They buried Marcel Lubens where he lay, at the bottom of the world's deepest cave, 400 meters below the Pyrenean surface. Jacques Cousteau, who had been with Lubens on the discovery of the ancient lake chamber the day before, took a chisel and carved his epitaph into the rock beside the grave. Before the team ascended to the surface, they made a promise to each other, and to the man they were leaving, that they would come back, that they would bring him home, that they would see to it that Marcel Lubens received a Christian burial, in the ground above the surface, in the company of his family. They made this promise at a graveside 400 meters underground, in a cave, in the dark. And then they climbed out. 2 years passed. In 1953, a separate expedition, not a retrieval, but an exploration, entered the Pierre Saint-Martin system and pushed further than any previous team. They discovered a chamber so large that it redefined what people understood an underground room to be. The Salle de la Verna, 255 meters wide, 245 meters long, 194 meters high. At the time of its discovery, it was the largest known underground chamber in the world, a space so vast that a standard hot air balloon was later flown inside it. This discovery was made in the cave that held Marcel Lubin's, the greatest underground chamber ever found, in the cave where a 28-year-old lay buried. On August 15, 1954, the remains of Marcel Lubin's were brought to the surface of the Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin. He was buried in the ground above, in a churchyard, in the company of his family. The promise made at 400 meters was kept. A plaque commemorates him at the bottom of the shaft.